Special Forces operators don't carry gear stamped military grade, they carry what survives. The company that put that phrase on your bug out knife isn't run by operators. The brand on your tactical vest, owned by a firm that just lost 62% of its value overnight. Neither one is who you think. Walk into any sporting goods store or scroll through any prepper forum and you'll see the same wall of names. Gerber, 511 Tactical, Case, Buck, Benchmade. You assume you're choosing between competitors, each one earning your money by building something better than the last. That's the illusion. Two of the biggest names on that wall don't answer to preppers, to veterans, or to the guy stocking his bug out bag. And the label on the front of the package was never going to tell you that. It's not supposed to. And once you see who actually does own these brands, you'll never look at a knife blister pack the same way again. Start with the knife. Gerber built its name on U.S. Special Forces contracts, on Bear Grylls survival shows, on the words legendary and military grade stamped across every package sold in Bass Pro and Cabela's. The company was founded in Portland, Oregon in 1939, when an ad executive named Joseph Gerber mailed 24 handmade kitchen knife sets to his own clients as Christmas gifts. Those knives were good enough that Abercrombie and Fitch asked to sell them. That's the story Gerber still tells. In 1987, the privately owned company was sold. The buyer was Fiskars, a Finnish conglomerate that traces its own roots back to 1649. Within a few years, the majority of Gerber's production had moved out of its Tegard, Oregon factory floor and into contract facilities in China. That's not a footnote in a company history. That's the exact moment the brand your grandfather trusted stopped answering to people like him. On BladeForums, the largest cutlery community online, the reaction to that shift isn't a single angry post. It's a running conversation that has stayed active for well over a decade. One longtime member summed it up in 5 words. Been crashing ever since. Quality-wise. Another pointed to something sharper. Fiskars sells its own budget axe, the X7, for roughly half of what Bass Pro charges for the Gerber version carrying an identical design. Same tool, probably the same factory, different sticker. Others in the same thread pointed to a specific product pattern. Big fixed blades with thin tangs, hollow plastic handles, where earlier models used solid construction. The kind of detail a buyer only notices after the knife has already failed him in the field. One member floated a scenario that summed up the room. If a rival cutlery company ever bought Gerber away from Fiskars, he said, it would be the best thing to happen to the brand in decades. Nobody in that thread disagreed with him. That's Gerber's owner. The Finnish half of this story. The other half is still coming, and it's the one that ends with the company losing more than half its value in a single afternoon. Fiskars is not running a survival gear empire, and that's worth sitting with for a second. Outside of Gerber, their brand portfolio is Iittala glassware, Royal Copenhagen porcelain, Waterford crystal, Wedgwood china, Georg Jensen jewelry. Tableware and luxury goods sold to a completely different customer than the guy buying a fixed blade for his bug out bag. Gerber is the one outdoor brand sitting inside a catalog built for wedding registries. In October of 2024, Fiskars announced it was splitting itself into 2 entirely separate business areas, one for tools and outdoor gear, one for luxury tabletop and design. Gerber sits in the smaller half of that split, a knife company riding alongside garden shears and cooking tools inside a corporate structure built around scissors, not survival. A 375-year-old Nordic design company holding on to one American knife brand because it still turns a profit, not because anyone inside that company understands what a bushcrafter needs a blade to do. And yet Gerber still bids for military contracts, in writing, in front of a federal oversight board. Government Accountability Office records show the company formally protesting a Defense Logistics Agency decision, arguing it deserved a combat knife contract over a smaller competitor. A federal contract doesn't require the company's own customers to trust it. It requires a low enough bid and a name recognizable enough to win the paperwork. Those are two very different tests, and only one of them is printed on the box. A count of Gerber's current product listings shows roughly a fifth are still made at the Portland facility. The rest comes from contract manufacturing overseas, not hidden, just not led with. Now take the vest. 511 Tactical didn't start as a tactical brand at all, and the actual origin has almost nothing to do with law enforcement or the military or anything most buyers would guess. In 1979, a rock climber named Royal Robbins was working the Salate wall on El Capitan in Yosemite when he decided his pants weren't cutting it for the climb. He and his wife Liz designed a cargo pant with a carabiner loop for their own outdoor label. That's it. That's the whole origin. In 1992, the FBI National Academy adopted that same pant as standard issue for every new cadet, and a piece of climbing gear quietly became federal law enforcement's uniform. In 1999, Robbins sold a majority stake to a former Navy SEAL named Dan Costa. By 2003, Costa owned the whole operation, stripped it down to 8 core products, and relaunched it as 511 Tactical, borrowed from the climbing difficulty rating that inspired the original pants. In 2007, a Boston private equity firm called TA Associates bought a majority stake in the company for $305 million, nearly a decade before Compass Diversified ever entered the picture. The Rush backpack line launched that same year and became the tactical backpack every competitor tried to copy. The Strike Pant redefined the cargo category in 2012. 6 products grew into a catalog holding more than 7,000 items. For over a decade, 511 became the uniform of an entire subculture, worn by actual law enforcement, by contractors, and by civilians who wanted to look the part. Then in 2016, everything about who controlled that brand changed. Compass Diversified Holdings, a publicly traded holding company out of Westport, Connecticut, bought 511 for $400 million. $250 million of that price was funded through new term loan debt, not cash on hand. CODI walked away, owning 97.5% of the company that made the FBI's pants. Debt taken on to buy a brand doesn't disappear once the deal closes. It gets serviced. Every quarter, out of somewhere, and the brand itself is usually the somewhere. By its own regulatory filings, 511 draws more than half its total sales, roughly 57%, from direct sales to law enforcement, military, and first responder agencies. The rest comes from the civilian market, the guy who wants to look like the operator he's watching on his feed. That split is the business model, built deliberately. The brand earned its credibility through federal contracts, then sold that same credibility at full retail markup to anyone willing to pay for it. Under CODI's ownership, that formula worked commercially. Annual sales grew past $500 million, and the retail footprint expanded past 120 stores nationwide. Growth like that isn't evidence the ownership structure is working for the buyer. It's evidence the label still sells, whether or not anyone behind it is being held to anything. A basic emergency kit at retail can run $200 or more the moment it carries that credibility as a label instead of a generic one sitting on the shelf next to it. FEMA's own published guidance for basic emergency preparedness comes down to water, food, a flashlight, a first aid kit, nothing branded, nothing tactical. Buy those separately, without the branding, and the total doesn't come close to the retail price of the kit sold under a name like Gerber or 511. That gap isn't buying you more survival, it's buying you the label, and the label is the one part of the kit that costs the company almost nothing to produce. Compass Diversified doesn't build tactical gear, and it never has. Alongside 5.11, its portfolio has included Ergo Baby, a baby carrier company, Marucci Sports, a baseball bat maker, Primaloft, an insulation manufacturer, and, until the fraud surfaced, Lugano, a diamond and jewelry brand. Tactical apparel sits on the same balance sheet as baseball bats and diamond rings, reviewed by the same executives, judged against the same quarterly targets, in the same board meetings where nobody in the room has ever field tested a plate carrier. That's not how a craftsman runs a shop. That's how a fund manager runs a portfolio, and portfolios diversify. They don't specialize. In May of 2025, that model showed its cracks in public. CODI disclosed that its jewelry subsidiary, Lugano, had been cooking its books for years. The stock dropped 59% in a single trading day, erasing roughly $700 million in market value before the closing bell. Restated numbers showed Lugano's reported inventory had been overstated by more than $375 million, nearly 40% of what the company claimed on paper. Its actual revenue turned out to be more than 85% lower than what CODI had reported to its own shareholders for 2 straight years. None of those figures matter as figures. What they mean is that a company managing 9 or 10 unrelated businesses at once was so far removed from one of its own subsidiaries that it missed nearly $100 million a year in fabricated numbers for 2 years running without catching it internally. 6 months later, in November, Lugano filed for Chapter 11. CODI was left explaining that it had been in breach of its own loan covenants that entire time. Shareholders filed suit covering every purchase made between February of 2022 and May of 2025, seeking damages that could climb past $50 million. CODI's own chief executive said the discovery didn't reflect who the company believed itself to be. A statement made after the damage was already public and the stock had already collapsed. The company's statement afterward insisted the fraud was isolated to Lugano and that its other subsidiaries, 5.1 of them included, were performing fine. Maybe that's technically true on a balance sheet. It still misses the point. When a company treats a jewelry line, a furniture maker, and the uniform of American law enforcement as interchangeable line items on the same quarterly report, the incentive was never to master any one of them. It's to extract cash from all of them evenly, and hope none of them ever needs the kind of specialized attention a single-focused company would give it. 511 didn't do anything wrong here. Nobody is accusing it of fraud. But it's owned by a structure that just proved, on the legal record, exactly how thin its internal oversight can get when nobody with actual expertise is watching closely enough. CODI has already shown it will walk away from a piece of that portfolio the moment the math turns. In 2024, it sold its entire Crosman airgun division, brands including Crosman and Benjamin that hunters and preppers had trusted for decades, to a competitor called Daisy Manufacturing, simply because the numbers pointed that direction on a spreadsheet in Westport. The brands didn't fail. Nothing about the products changed. The parent company decided they were worth more to somebody else's portfolio than its own. None of that fraud, none of that debt would carry any weight if the word on the package actually meant something. It doesn't, and it never has. Military grade has no legal definition the Federal Trade Commission enforces. No test the product has to pass, no agency that signs off, no government body checking the claim before it hits a shelf in Cabela's or a big box store. A former Marine and military journalist named Alex Hollings, writing for Sandbox News, put it plainly: when you see military grade on anything that isn't actually issued to troops, it's marketing, full stop. Ford learned this in 2015, advertising the F-150's aluminum body as military grade, a specific alloy that, according to multiple outlets that checked, doesn't officially exist under that name in any real defense specification. The truck sold fine anyway. Nobody at Ford was ever required to prove the claim, because nobody with authority to challenge it was ever going to ask. Even inside the defense industry, the phrase gets fought over. In 2023, 2 helicopter manufacturers competing for a British military contract publicly disputed whose aircraft actually qualified as military grade. The closest thing to an actual standard, MIL STD 810, is itself loosely defined, a general environmental testing document with no single governing body confirming whether a commercial product actually meets it. Anyone can claim compliance. Almost no one checks. If defense contractors can't agree on what the term means to each other, it was never going to mean anything printed on a knife box. So which owner is worse, the Finnish design company or the Wall Street holding company? Wrong question. They're two different methods landing in the same place. Fiskars extracts quietly, heritage intact, manufacturing moved offshore a little at a time, a knife brand kept around mostly because the numbers still work. Compass diversified extracts structurally, dozens of unrelated brands bundled into one portfolio, managed for cash flow instead of craft, with enough distance between the boardroom and the factory floor that a jewelry fraud goes undetected for 2 years. One method is patient and quiet, the other is leveraged and distracted. Different country, different method, same result. The company answering to you on the package is never the one setting the priorities. You might already be thinking, foreign ownership by itself isn't automatically the problem, and you'd be right. A Japanese or German company can run a tighter operation than an American one. Nationality doesn't determine craftsmanship, and plenty of foreign-owned manufacturers hold themselves to a higher standard than domestic ones chasing the same margins. The Fiskars story and the CODI story aren't proof that foreign or Wall Street ownership is inherently worse than domestic ownership. They're proof that once a brand becomes one line item inside a much larger unrelated portfolio, whether that portfolio sits in Helsinki or Connecticut, the expertise that built its reputation stops being the priority that runs it. A single brand Finnish knife company answering only to knife buyers would look nothing like Fiskars. A single brand American apparel company answering only to law enforcement customers would look nothing like CODI's version of 5.1. It's the structure, not the flag on the paperwork, that decides what gets protected and what gets quietly deprioritized. None of this means throw away your Gerber or burn your 511 pants tonight. This is the part that actually changes what you spend money on going forward. 3 checks, and none of them take longer than reading a product label already does. Look up who actually owns the brand. A 5-minute search will tell you if you're buying from an independent shop or a portfolio company. Check where it's actually manufactured, not where the headquarters sits, since even brands that advertise domestic assembly sometimes source raw steel overseas. Then ignore the words on the package entirely and look at the steel type, the stitching, the warranty terms, the things a real owner has to put their name behind. If you want a knife from a company that still answers to itself, 3 are worth knowing. W.R. Case has manufactured every blade in Bradford, Pennsylvania since 1889, running the steel through more than 160 separate manufacturing steps by hand, owned by fellow Bradford company Zippo, not a holding fund. Buck Knives moved production to China in 2000 under retailer pressure, at one point sourcing nearly a third of its lineup overseas, reversed course in 2005, and now builds most of its lineup in Post Falls, Idaho, with roughly 87% of its current catalog made in that same Idaho facility. Benchmade did it in reverse, manufacturing overseas early on before pulling assembly back to Oregon City in 2010, though roughly half its steel is still imported. Even so, worth checking before you assume domestic assembly means domestic everything. None of these 3 is flawless, but in every case, you can trace who's accountable for what you're holding, which is the one thing a Helsinki stock exchange listing and a Connecticut holding company will never give you. Tactical apparel doesn't offer the same easy alternative, and that's worth admitting instead of inventing a recommendation that doesn't exist. There's no Bradford, Pennsylvania equivalent for cargo pants. No single-family workshop still stitching FBI-grade fabric a century after it started. What you can do is apply the same checks anyway, and treat any brand's claim about who wears their gear as a sales pitch, not a spec sheet. The industry doesn't need you to boycott anyone. It needs you distracted by the color of the housing and the word on the label, so you never ask who signs the checks behind either one. Check the parent company before you check the price tag.